All right. We're recording in all 17 places, James Cridland.
That's exciting.
It's exciting. Yeah, and I asked you right when we connected, like, where do you live? And you're like, oh, I live in tomorrow, basically, because you're in Australia.
I am indeed.
Nice. And there's one thing that always gives me energy, and that's grunting. So, James, along with your morning coffee, you have to do a little bit of grunting with me. Ow! Just don't pull a muscle. Oh, my goodness. Oh. Welcome, everyone, to the Podcast Engineering Show. My name is Chris Curran, and I produce podcasts for a bunch of big companies and mid-sized companies. And I also run Podcast Engineering School. You probably knew that, but I teach people how to engineer and produce podcasts at a professional level. I have a background as an audio engineer in the music business, and ever since I entered the podcasting space about 8 years ago, I noticed a huge lack of audio skills with podcasters, and that's where I can help. Because I've been doing my own show, this show for a while, and I've been doing some other shows, and I really just love teaching podcasters how to produce better audio because, you know, it's not easy for someone who doesn't know audio. And so that's where if you listen to this show and if you implement the best of what you learn here, your podcast will sound a lot better and you'll spend less time producing them. And of course, the next semester of Podcast Engineering School is coming up soon. Soon. That's when, James. Is that specific enough?
Soon. That's absolutely fine.
Well, you have to...
more details on the website, I'm sure.
Thank you, exactly, because you know the problem, James. And I'm gonna formally introduce James Cridland in a second, but I got so far ahead with recording episodes that this episode we're only recording the week before because I'm putting this on one of the daily goodie weeks, the week I usually put out a small episode of daily goodies, but so this is a big goodie. James Cridland's here, but I have episodes recorded for the next 5 months.
Wow.
And it gets weird because I'll be doing an interview and it's like we'll talk and it's like, well, the guest will say something and in the back of my mind I'm like, well, but he's saying it, he's talking about something right now, but this isn't going to come out for 5 months. It's going to be weird.
Yes. Oh. I'm really looking forward to podcast movement. That's not going to work. It's not going to work in 5 months.
Exactly. So, well, James Cridland, you are the editor of Podnews, and everyone knows, if you don't know Podnews, it's probably it's definitely the best daily newsletter, email newsletter on podcasting. It absolutely is.
That's very kind.
I can't believe, I mean, you must put a lot of time and energy every day into that thing, right?
Yeah, there is quite a lot of time that it takes, but it's a really enjoyable thing, and it's something that I've been doing every single day for the last 2 years or so. I made a bit of a mistake when I built the classified advertising section of it, in that I forgot to account for any public holidays.
Oh,
and so therefore I have to publish every single day. But it's quite fun. It gives me a good routine, which is always nice.
Yeah, it'll keep you on track, but that's every day is tough. I mean, doing a weekly podcast is tough for most people. Yeah. So daily is rough.
Well, every day is tough, particularly since I do an awful lot of travel. So I go around the world with my other hat on, which is helping radio stations understand what the future is. Which is an interesting job, and because I do quite a lot of that around the world, quite a lot of the editing of Podnews and the recording of the podcast that goes with it, of course, has to happen in airport lounges and stuff like that. So that's always a little bit of fun as well.
Nice. And you've been in radio for 30 years, and now that you're sort of consulting radio stations about the future. Are you, when you bring up, do they ask about podcasting and or when you bring it up, are the radio people afraid of podcasting?
Oh, I think that some of them certainly are. I think, you're always afraid of the unknown, and I think that quite a few radio companies, just simply do not understand it. But I think there's also a difference between North American radio companies in the rest of the world, in that the rest of the world will typically do things first for the audience. Will this delight the audience? Will this please the audience? Will this make the audience happy? In which case we will do it, because it will result in more money for us in the future, And then you look at North American radio, and North American radio is very much, can I make money out of this tomorrow? In which case I'll do it. And if I can't make any money out of it tomorrow, I won't. So there's a big difference. And can you instantly make money out of podcasting if you're a radio station? Probably not. Will you be able to make money out of podcasting if you're a radio station in the next 6 months? Absolutely you will. And I think it's a different mindset. And so it's an interesting conversation to have with them, yeah.
Cool. Right? So, all right. So we're going to go through the speed round in a second, but we're also going to talk about LUFS level and bit rates as well, because you wrote an article on each one of those, and you have some really good information that we can discuss. But first, the speed round. Yeah. Take us through when you're about to record. Let's say you're at home and you're about to record your podcast. Tell us, what microphone you're using, where it's plugged in, how it's getting into the computer, and like what software you're using to record it, and then just overview the post-production real quick, all the way up until you're uploading the file.
Yeah, well, this is going to be a very quick lightning round. I have a microphone. It plugs into the computer. So I have a Rode Podcaster microphone, which is a USB microphone. It's a condenser microphone. No, it's not. It's a dynamic microphone.
Yep.
Anyway, and it's very good. And it plugs straight into my laptop, which is a MacBook Pro. I record on Hindenburg Journalist Pro, which is excellent, which I then use to edit afterwards. Occasionally I'll put in clips and stuff, and quite often I will, edit out any fluffs and stuff. And then Hindenburg outputs in two different types of file, an AAC file and an MP3 file, which I then upload to its spot on Amazon S3 because I self-host, and that is basically it. So that's my entire thing. And the room that I'm in is relatively echoey, which is a problem, although good microphone technique helps with that. As does a little bit of foam on the walls. But one of the biggest issues that I have with this room is that here in Australia, we don't really understand how insulation works. And so the entire house is made out of wood. And so it's literally just two bits of wood, and that's the outside wall. So it makes everything that goes on outside really loud inside.
Oh, interesting.
as a thing. So, we're on an approach for the local airport. There are 3 television stations at the top of the mountain, which I live very close by, and they all have helicopters.
Wow.
So quite often there will be a bit of noise, which is a little bit frustrating. But accepting that, it's a pretty good space to be, I think.
Right? Yeah. So your episodes of your show are about 3 to 4 minutes long. So
yeah,
how long is the raw recording before you edit it?
It's normally about 3 or 4 minutes because I will go from a script. So the podcast and indeed Podnews itself, the newsletter, is specifically not built to have any form of opinion. Because I have far too many opinions. So therefore I try and keep all of the opinions out of Podnews, which is, I think, a good thing. And so therefore what I will typically do is I will read from the same scripts that I have written for the newsletter itself, and basically, ad-lib through a few of the things on there. So basically, it's normally, I would guess if a typical episode is 3 minutes long, normally the audio will be about 3 minutes 10 or 3 minutes 20. So there are normally only a couple of edits in there.
Got it. And I just came up with a new show idea for you, okay? It's called Podnews Opinions. And you can allow your readers and listeners to leave a voicemail or send in audio of their opinion about something. And then
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, do you know the really weird thing though that has happened?
What?
Recently, I've been getting a few people. You know, you can just hit reply and have your say, and I'm beginning to get people hitting reply on the newsletter and having their say about stuff. And I thought, well, I should be printing this. I mean, this is a letters page in a newspaper, so I will only put first names on, so you can say what you like. And so I've begun to do that in the last couple of weeks, and that has been surprisingly and almost suspiciously popular. So there's definitely something going on there. But I think opinion, hearing from other people in the community is a really important thing, and I've been searching for a way of doing that for quite some time.
Yeah, because it's not so easy. I mean, a lot of people would probably tell you, "Ooh, just start a Facebook group," but like that's, you know what I mean. You have to find the right way to do it for you and your brand and everything. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think if you are an edited newsletter first and foremost, then actually, you can have some edited correspondence that has gone through an editor just like all of the news pieces have. And I think that's probably perfectly valid. But yeah, I mean, Facebook groups, and, I thought for a while about running a Discord group, and those are great. And then I realized that I'm asleep when most people are awake, because I live in Australia, not because I have a weird social life.
Right.
And so therefore, I was thinking, actually, that is 9-10 hours where, I wouldn't be able to actually monitor what on earth is going on, and that's a dangerous thing. So probably less of that.
Wow.
But it's all a really interesting sort of side, and the side of making a vibrant community is something that I've done in previous roles, and it's there's a real science to it, I think.
Right. Okay. So let's get back to your setup. So you use the Rode Podcaster, which is a USB mic, which is I've heard good things about that mic. I've never tried one though. You like it?
Yeah, no, it's a really good. Well, I'll tell you a story about it. I was on the way back from Podfest, actually, and I had taken this microphone to Podfest, and I was on my way back, and of course I packed it in my checked baggage. Tip: don't do that.
Oh no.
And by the time I was back in Australia, it's only 23 hours on the plane.
Oh,
so when I was back in Australia, I plugged it in and I wanted to record the next Podnews, and realised that it was completely deaf and it had stopped working. Oh. And I thought to myself, this is a shame. Now I have a couple of Shure microphones locked away in a cupboard for just this eventuality. And I thought to myself, well, I'll plug those in. And then I remembered that this microphone comes with a 10-year warranty.
10 years.
And so I thought, and Rode are a Australian company. And so I thought, well, I will send it in and I will say it was broken in my checked baggage on the way back from the US. Is there anything you can do for me? And they have come back. They have no idea who I am, by the way. And they have come back to me, not just with a repaired microphone, which would have been quite easy, but they've actually come back to me. They sent me back a version 2 of the microphone, which has a few interesting tweaks in there. And I thought to myself, that is a company which, understands how to delight audiences. They really do, because, I was not expecting them to turn around and give me a brand new microphone just because the United States TSA had, had damaged it.
Yeah, zapped it.
So I was really, really impressed at them.
That's great. I've always heard great things about Rode. I've never heard any bad thing about the company Rode, so that's awesome. And so for the version 2 of the Podcaster, what were those couple features that they added?
Well, so I think there's no information on this at all. There's no documentation on this, and weirdly, the instruction manual that comes with the microphone is the same as the version 1. But what I've been able to understand is, firstly, the output is a little bit quieter, which is actually very helpful because it was maxing out a few things. So that's a good thing. It's got a slightly different color volume control. But the most important thing is that there is a power LED. Now, on version 1, the power LED would light up green, and that was fine. And that was a lovely thing. In version 2, the power LED lights up green, and then when you talk into it, it's orange. And if you talk into it rather too loudly, it turns red. And that's really helpful because it's a very simple, straightforward way of understanding how loud you are.
Yeah.
And I found that a really handy thing.
That's pretty cool. See, the little things really add up and make a big difference. So,
yeah.
All right. So you're using a MacBook Pro. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, and the one thing that I need for the microphone, because it's just got a desk stand at the moment, and so therefore, if I drum my fingers on the desk, then obviously that's dreadful. So the one thing I need is to go out and buy a proper mic stand for it. But small steps.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that because I've been having conversations with people for some reason about the Blue Yeti over the last couple days, and that's one of the
you lucky man.
That's one of the worst things about that mic is the rumble from the table or the desk that it's on.
Yeah,
and
yeah. No, it's a difficult thing, but I've got used to, keeping silent. which is always hard, but yeah, and it also means that I can't type while, because otherwise, again, you just get that horrible noise. So
yeah. All right, that's good. Okay, so the MacBook Pro that you're using, is that a newer one or an older one?
It's one that cost an eye-watering $2,699, although they are Australian dollars and not real ones. But it's one of the MacBook Pro touch bar things, completely overspec'd for what I need in this particular instance. But another one of my jobs is going and doing public speaking, and I have a very complicated slide deck with lots of video and audio in there. So it was great for that. So normally I use a MacBook Pro, which is this version with, so it's got SSD inside it, so it's completely silent, which is handy. And it's got the weird touch bar. The other day, though, I actually recorded my podcast on a Chromebook, which is kind of the reverse. It's an incredibly low spec machine. I was using a piece of Android, an Android app on there called Orphonic Edit, which just records from the USB mic, and that again sounded absolutely fine. So it was a really interesting, it was an interesting test the other day of having to use a Chromebook rather than a MacBook Pro. And everything was still really easy. So I'm kind of there thinking to myself, why have I spent $2,699 on a laptop when I could have spent $300? But anyway, that's kind of a side thing.
Well, James, I already know the answer, because after talking to me and listening to my show, then you're going to want to go out and buy some plugins, and they're going to require some power.
Yes, you are probably correct.
My students really like. There's so many of my students who are like, they're like, you're the devil. You just make me spend more money on plugins. But I don't force them. No, but anyway.
I can see that.
So interesting. I recently tried I've used it many times, the Orphonic Edit app on my Android phone. And it works really well. It records really well. It records in, wave format, right? Like 48 kilohertz wave. It's great, right? But then I was trying to get the file off my phone, and I couldn't I couldn't upload the file, and I thought it was the app that was the problem. Turns out I was trying to upload the file to my Google Drive, and about a week later, when I finally figured it out, in Google Drive, there's a setting that it says only upload through Wi-Fi, and that was checked.
Yes.
So and I never use Wi-Fi anymore at home. I literally keep the Wi-Fi off because I don't like the radiation and all that. But So I switch that off, and then it just uploads files fine. So so many settings.
What's nice about Auphonic, because I actually use that as my when I'm on the road, I will just take my phone and I will just use that. What's nice about Auphonic in total, and certainly Auphonic Edit, is that it doesn't just upload the file to Auphonic. You can also set it to then upload the finished file to Amazon S3 in my case. So this is perfect for me because that's where I host my audio, and so therefore, it's one button and it uploads it, encodes it into the right formats, sends it off to Amazon S3, and everybody's happy. So when I'm on the road, that's exactly what I end up doing. And and at home, I've got Hindenburg Journalist producing 2 different versions of my audio and uploading that as well. So so that's a really helpful tool, I think.
Yeah, and the Auphonic, in addition to everything you mentioned that Auphonic does, it also levels it to the right LUFS level, and even can do noise reduction if you need that. But you probably don't use that, right?
Yeah, so I normally turn that off. It depends how loud the airport lounge is.
Right.
I don't use Auphonic when I'm at home, but certainly, using it out and about, it can be useful. And it also will do, dynamic compression and all that kind of stuff on there as well. So yeah, it's a really useful toolkit. And the weird thing is, of course, that given that my podcast is normally 2 or 3 minutes long, and Auphonic give you 2 hours worth of free audio every month, I have yet to pay for it.
Right.
So,
it's 2 hours a month, right? Free?
Yeah. So there's always a benefit of having a really short podcast.
Right? 3 minutes a day times 30 days, that's 90 minutes. You're still under the...
Yeah, exactly.
By the way, if I ever see you recording your show in an airport or a hotel lobby or something, I'm going to just come by and I'm going to yell out, "Podcast Engineering Show." And you have to leave that in, James. You can't edit that out, okay?
Well, if you can get into the lounges that I can get into, I'll be surprised.
Now everyone's going to be looking for you, and they're going to start yelling. They're promoting their show. It'd be funny.
Yeah, Dave Jackson saw me recording it once at a podcast that I was at, and actually filmed a video of me recording a podcast, which was really meta.
Wow.
Yeah, that was good fun. That was good fun.
Wait, so you also mentioned in Auphonic that you use the new dynamic compression. Is that where you can set the LUFS variation? What do they call that?
No, there's a bit of dynamic compression. You can change how the compressor works, which I've not done, to be honest. I just let Auphonic do whatever it wants to end up doing. I make sure with Auphonic you set your LUFS level on the project rather than per file, which, as I've patiently explained to the man from Auphonic, is the wrong thing to do. But anyway, so I use it primarily to just make sure that the audio level is right, and to make sure that that it basically gets uploaded into the right spaces. You can play around with compression levels. You can play around with attack and release and all that kind of stuff that frankly I don't fully understand. So I'm much happier just to leave it to Auphonic, and I'm sure that they will do a fantastic job as they normally do. But also, how good is the sound of a mobile phone microphone anyway? Quite often it's not the world's best. So
right.
It's got a pretty bad piece of audio going into it. So anything it can do to actually improve that, is always a good plan.
Right. Yeah, I remembered what I was thinking about too, is that you can set the dynamic range in terms of loudness units. So you can have like the most aggressive is like 3 or 4 loudness units, which means it really compresses it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And then you can go all the way up to like maybe 15 or 16 or 20, I'd forget. And so if you pick
I haven't spotted that.
Yeah, if you pick like 15 or 16 or something, it's very dynamic, meaning at times it'll be loud, at times it'll be soft. But if you pick like 3 or 4 loudness units as the dynamic range, man, it'll compress the bejesus out of that thing, which is, it won't sound that good. Probably the highest I would go would be like 5 loudness units or 6.
Yeah.
So, because, if you really, you don't want to crush it, but you don't want 15 or 16 loudness units dynamic range, because that's too much.
No, because that's basically not compressing it at all. So you need to make something that is easy. Again, this comes from my radio background. You need to make something that is easy to be heard. That's the most important thing. And and not not crushing it is usually a good start. And just making it sound as loud as everything else on your device, which we'll get to, I'm sure, in a bit. Yeah.
And I just came up with another brilliant, I'm calling my own idea brilliant, a brilliant entrepreneurial idea for you, James. You could, with your radio experience, you could drive around Australia in a car listening to podcasts, and it would be like Dave Jackson's rodeo show, where you'll try to listen to it with all the road noise, and if it just doesn't cut it, then you just, you gotta call it as you see it.
Well, it's an idea. It's certainly a large place, I'll tell you.
God.
So that would certainly keep you going. I think that there's some place in southern Australia which is the longest straight road in the world. And it's I'm making this up, but it's somewhere like 220 kilometers long, and it's completely straight.
Oh my God.
And you're just there thinking, wow, how many people must have just fallen asleep on that road?
Wow.
That's quite a thing.
Or how many planes landed on it.
Well, yeah, indeed. How long is this runway?
Be like, should we land now or wait? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so you're using Hindenburg when you're at home, and so
I am.
You record into Hindenburg directly.
Yep, right. Record directly into Hindenburg. Yeah.
Yep, and then do you add any effects there? Any processing?
I do, yes. So I use the standard Hindenburg compressor. I always like a compressor that has one knob on it, and that's all that the Hindenburg one does. And so that goes up about halfway. Nice. So I use that. I use a little bit of EQ as well. The Hindenburg EQ is actually quite good. It allows you to have quite a lot of control. So I tend to use a little bit of that just to roll off the bass completely, to have a little bit of additional treble. And all that kind of stuff. Don't really know what I'm doing. I read something on the internet about it. And that's normally the only two things that I do. Hindenburg has a very good thing called a voice profiler, which will apparently you can feed it a voice that you want to sound like, and it will fiddle around with with that particular channel to make you sound like that. I tried it on James Earl Jones. It didn't quite do what I was expecting. And so I've used that in the past, but I keep it relatively simple and straightforward. Yeah.
Nice. And then, so then one of the and you mentioned this already, but one of the coolest things about Hindenburg is you can publish to several destinations right from Hindenburg, meaning normally with some DAW software, like I use Reaper and people use Adobe Audition, you have to render the file, and then the file ends up in a folder, and then you have to go upload it to Libsyn or Blueberry, whatever. But Hindenburg, you just hit publish, and it does everything all in one shot, right? It mixes it down and uploads it.
Yeah, exactly right. So what Hindenburg would do if I was using a standard podcast host is it would, as you say, completely upload it. So you can set all of the metadata, the artwork and everything else. You can set through Hindenburg. You can even set RAD tags in there for NPR's new tracking system. You can then upload it. And it's just one button, and you tell it what your username and password is for Libsyn, for example, and it will automatically upload it for you. So that is really cool. What I actually use it for is I produce 2 different versions of the podcast. I produce the standard version that I produce is 80K AAC plus. So that's what most people get because I host it for myself, and so therefore I have to be relatively stingy about bitrate and stuff like that. And then I also produce a 320K stereo MP3. Which is ridiculously over-engineered. That goes to two different places. It goes to Amazon Alexa and it goes to Spotify. And the reason why it goes to both of those places is that both Spotify and Amazon Alexa will by default cache your audio. And in fact, Amazon takes your audio, if you're using news briefings as I am, takes your audio and remasters it and does something weird with it, probably to get the loudness levels right. And so therefore, because they're hosting the audio, frankly, I'll give them as proper quality as I possibly can. And so that's why I'm producing two different versions. The AAC HE version at minus 16 LUFS and the beautiful 320K MP3 at minus 14 LUFS.
Oh, I see. All right. Mm. This is interesting. And so one thing that already came to mind is because a lot of podcasters, they publish their show if it's stereo, 128 kbps, or if it's mono, 64. And the reason most podcasters do that is because those files they still sound pretty good, and that's kind of about as small of a file as you can go before it starts to really sound like crap. So, but in your case, the reason you're able to send this really high resolution file for Alexa and Spotify is because you're hosting it yourself using Amazon S3?
Yeah, so that's because, it's partially because I'm hosting it myself, but on the other side, it's because both of those services, and I should be giving Deezer the same one as well, both of those services will cache your audio and therefore play the audio back from their servers.
Right.
So therefore, I don't need to worry about bandwidth costs because obviously they're paying for it. So I'll give them the highest possible quality, and they can do with it whatever they want to.
Right. And so
yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing.
So, but the point I was trying to make was that, for instance, I upload my show just to Libsyn, right? And Libsyn distributes it everywhere, including Spotify and Alexa. Now, if I uploaded a 320 kbps file, that would be much bigger, and that would like with Libsyn, I only get so many megabytes per month.
Yeah, exactly.
So if I'm going to upload a monster file, then I might need to upgrade my plan with Libsyn and pay more money.
Yeah, exactly. And so the reason, and I get dinged for doing that with Amazon S3 as well, because obviously I pay for bandwidth.
Right.
And so therefore, the more bandwidth that is used, the more it costs me to host my podcast. So that's why I don't give everybody a 320K MP3 file, and frankly, it's not worth it. So therefore, I wouldn't be doing that anyway. But in this particular case, certainly somebody noticed. I did go down to 64K AC plus a while ago, and somebody did notice that once Amazon had taken the audio in, had resampled it or something to do whatever it is that they do for news briefings, it ended up sounding a bit metallic and a bit ropey. And so I thought to myself, well, actually, I can just give Amazon a different version of the file. And so that's what I'm able to do with because I host for myself. I think one of the really useful things is that yes, I produce a podcast and I write a newsletter, but I also do all of the tech as well. So the tech for how the newsletter gets sent out. And the publishing system and all of that. I've written the RSS feed generator, all of that stuff, so that I'm able to do some interesting things that most podcast hosts actually can't. And one of those, for example, is actually giving Spotify a different version of the file and just spotting when Spotify is coming in and actually saying, there you go, you can have that version. Right. And that's a really helpful thing, actually.
Right. So now I'm curious though, when you when you're in Hindenburg and you're publishing the final episode file, are you really you're publishing it to Amazon S3? correct?
So I could publish to Amazon S3. It would need an additional piece of software on my machine that would automatically mirror a folder on my computer with the Amazon S3 folder.
Okay.
So I could do that, and that would be absolutely fine. One thing that I have noticed after 2 years of doing this, sometimes not altogether sober, I should point out, particularly when you're recording this, because obviously I'm recording it late at night for consumption early morning in American time, and so therefore particularly around NAB a couple of weeks ago, my goodness,
wow,
some of them I ended up having to go back and re-record.
Oh no, wow.
But anyway. But the point of all of this is that that I certainly realized that quite often I will, by accident, overwrite a previous edition.
Oh.
And one of the things that Hindenburg doesn't do is it doesn't say, hey, it looks as if you're overwriting a file.
Oh.
I have reported this to them as a bug. They have said it's a feature, but they are going to make it.
Okay.
But yeah, and so one of the things that I learned very, very quickly is no, you can just overwrite all of your old stuff there. So what I actually do is I publish it to a local folder that happens to be on a Google Drive share anyway, and then I will manually upload it onto Amazon S3 using a standard FTP piece of software. But I need to use that anyway for the images within Podnews anyway, so it's no particular extra hassle. But I one of the things that I learned very early on when I was testing how Podnews might work is actually testing the workflow, and so everything from the time when it comes out to what is actually in it, how it looks, all of that is deliberately built to be as least amount of work as possible. And I deliberately did that because I wanted to make sure that I could always publish even when I was very time poor,
right.
and so one of the reasons why I self-host is that the last thing I wanted to end up doing is to upload it to Libsyn or wherever it might be, and then go in and have to update all kinds of files and pieces of metadata and everything else. I've already got all of that information. I do not need to type it in again. And so, a lot of it was very much, how can I save the most amount of time that I possibly can?
Right. Interesting. So is there a specific app you use to add all that metadata to the feeds?
Yeah, no. So because I've got the metadata, so the show notes for the Podnews podcast are the same is the same newsletter that you would get on email, and is the same newsletter that you get on the website as well, podnews.net. And so all of that is relatively, all of that is just automatically repurposed into the RSS feed. There are a few things that don't carry through into the RSS feed, and one of them is a big list of the supporters of the of the podcast and everything else. That doesn't get carried through because there's an awful lot of logos on there.
Right.
But pretty well everything else is all completely automatic, in there. And it's just built to be as simple and as automatic as I could do.
Yeah.
And it is all my own PHP code.
Cool.
So so I've been able to do some quite useful things just by being able to code quite a lot of this for myself.
That's awesome. And when you were explaining that, sometimes you might have a drink or two before you record the episode, I was remembering that movie Major League, when Bob Uecker, he was the guy calling the baseball games, and he was drinking the whole time. And there's one scene with him, and they turn to him, and he's like, today's game is brought to you by... and he's looking for shuffling papers, and he goes, "Oh Christ, I can't find it."
Yeah, no.
Are we ever going to hear that on Podnews?
We are not because of the beauty of recording. And one of the things that I tell my radio clients, and which they don't always appreciate, but one of the things that I tell my radio clients is that live radio is lazy radio. And actually, one of the things that they should be really doing is just do a bit of post-production on what you do. Don't just, obviously with a baseball, call, it's a different conversation. But right. If you're doing a music show, there is absolutely no requirement for you to be live, and it would sound much better if you weren't. And so, pre-recording, post-producing stuff is a really important thing. And I have there's an article on Podnews where I am allowed to be a little bit opinionated is in the articles. And there's an article in Podnews which is talking about the ideal length of your podcast. And I linked to lots of research and lots of sage people saying, well, maybe somewhere between 22 and 25 minutes might be the right thing. And all this based on, commuting time and all this kind of stuff. And at the end of it, my rule on how long a podcast should be is a podcast should be as long as it needs to be, but not a second longer. And that is the most important thing. So taking as many worthless minutes out as you possibly can and making it sound as good, as tight, as respectful of your audience's time as possible, is a really important thing. And so that's something which I've always believed in, and just making sure that everything sounds as good as it can do, even if it's slightly slurry.
James is going to be like, this Podnews is brought to you by... Oh, forget it. I can't find it. So a couple things about Amazon S3. I have two questions, and I don't know if you're going to want to answer either one. Number one, is it less expensive for you to use Amazon S3 than if you were to use Libsyn or Blueberry? And the second part of the question is, every time you talk to Rob Walsh and Todd Cochran, do they try to talk you into using their service?
Well, let me tell you why I self-host first. Part of it is because I want it to be really easy and quick, as I've mentioned. Right. But the other part of it is I can't really write things about podcast hosts if I am a customer of one of those podcast hosts. So at the end of the day, it's a bit of editorial independence that, clearly if I was to write something very naughty about, Todd, for example, then Todd might, quite rightly say, get off our service. And that's not what I want. So at the end of the day, yes, I actually did... specifically host for myself because of that. And there are a couple of downsides. But does it cost an awful lot? No, it's very cheap right now. I did actually work out what the costs were. And I will tell you, last month... When was this? 9 weeks ago. So whenever last month was 9 weeks ago, probably December, it cost me... a whole $5.15 in terms of bandwidth data transfer. So that's probably now that by the way is in total. That includes the Podnews website, and it also includes a number of other websites that I also run and everything else. So my guess on that is that it's probably costing me $2 or something to host my own podcast, on there. Right. In total, I'm paying Amazon probably $260. This is US dollars a month, because of all of the other stuff I do. So just bear that in mind. But in terms of self-hosting, it is very cheap as long as you are not very popular. Once you become really popular, then it all of a sudden becomes very expensive indeed. So I did some maths based on the Ron Burgundy podcast. I looked at how much I looked at how much downloads that it had got in the first 6 weeks, which was 7 million. I looked at the size of that file and worked out how much it would cost on Amazon S3 if I was to host it, and it would cost $12,000. And bless you, Ron Burgundy, but you're not worth $12,000 of my Amazon S3. So basically, there is an inflection point where it ends up being cheaper to use somebody like Libsyn or a Blueberry, but also you get absolutely zero stats. So you need to work out what you're going to do in terms of stats as well. So that's a very big issue there. Obviously.
Well, probably the only stat you can get is like how many times was this file, downloaded or queried or asked for, whatever that is.
Yeah, so you can get stats. You can get hit stats if you like. They're much the same as back when I was doing my first website in 1993. Everybody was talking about server hits. And so, yeah, absolutely, you can get server hits out of this, and server hits are fine. But what you don't get is proper full downloads, which the IAB would expect. You don't get, you can't deduplicate some of the stats that you have, etc., etc., etc. Now, there is a way of doing that. There's a piece of software called Amazon Athena, which is a great big database service which essentially uses your site logs as a database. So you can begin to do some quite fun things with that, of being able to pull your site logs together, being able to do the deduplication, being able to make sure that you're only counting full downloads and all of that kind of stuff. So I do have stats, but it's not as simple as logging into, your podcast host and having a look at a pretty pie graph. It's much more having a look at a very complicated bit of SQL database querying to come up with something which is vaguely accurate. And what that doesn't obviously have as well is it doesn't have any blacklist of where the bots are and everything else. So, if you're thinking about self-hosting your podcast, then my advice to you would be don't, and go and use a proper podcast host. Everybody from Omni Studio to Pippa to Libsyn, to Blueberry, all of those are great, and you would be a masochist if you wanted to host your own podcast on your own infrastructure, and there are very good reasons why I do that, but I wouldn't recommend that to anyone.
Right, and it's interesting what you cited about the Ron Burgundy podcast, that the 7 million downloads would cost about $12,000. So if the Ron Burgundy show was using Libsyn, certainly it wouldn't cost him $20 a month, right? Libsyn must have some sort of a pro level. They must charge more for that. I have no idea though.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that with many of the larger podcast hosts, then yes, they are charging significantly more. Of the enterprise podcast hosts like Art19 and Omni, and I know that Libsyn has an enterprise side in there as well. I don't know how it works in terms of Libsyn, but certainly hosting costs begin to be a real issue if you are a very successful podcaster. Thank heavens I'm not. But that certainly begins to be a really expensive cost. So it's weird because on one side you're looking at people like Spotify who cache your audio by default. And most podcast companies go, oh, we don't want that to happen because we want to be able to serve dynamic advertising and we want to be able to do X, Y, and Z, right. And we want to be able to get some stats from it and stuff like that. And from me, I'm there going, bring it on. As many companies that want to cache my audio, well, great, do it. Right. So it's a very different way of actually having a look at it. But podcast hosting is not free. And if you look at companies like, who are giving it away,
right.
Like Anchor, but there are plenty of other companies there as well, you might be forgiven for assuming that podcast hosting is very cheap. It really isn't. If you begin to get some serious numbers, then it begins to get very, very expensive very, very fast.
Interesting. Wow. All right, so let's move on because we need to talk about LUFS level. We got a little time left. We're going to talk about LUFS level real quick and also the bit rate. And I will link to these two articles you wrote in the show notes. So everybody, if you just go click through the show notes and you can actually see the posts that we're going to be discussing. So let's start with the LUFS. And I mean, it's a good article. You're talking about
LUFS. Yes.
Yeah, you're talking about LKFS or LUFS, and then you're talking about how loud should podcasts be. So boil this down for us, James.
So basically, you'll know how annoying it is when you're listening to a podcast and then all of a sudden somebody sends you a text message or a WhatsApp message or something and your ears get blown off by the fact that that noise of the text message is so much louder than the podcast. Or maybe you're driving and every time Google comes on to tell you to take the next right, that is really quiet and you have to really turn Google up. And then the podcast then ends up being really loud and so you have to turn it down and all of that. That is really annoying. And so there's a thing called LUFS, which is a measurement of loudness. And the thing called LUFS, the Americans call it LKFS because Americans have never got anything right.
Never.
But it's really called LUFS. And that's a measurement of loudness. It's basically how loud something sounds. And the basic number that you need to remember, the Audio Engineering Society has all kinds of misguided information about this, but the only piece of information you need to know is -16. Because LUFS has been made by audio engineers, it's a minus number instead of a plus number because audio engineers. But -16 is what Apple Podcasts want and what Google Podcasts want. And if you author your podcasts for -16 LUFS, it basically means that your podcast will be the same sound, the same loudness as Siri, the same loudness as the Google Assistant, or that WhatsApp noise, or the Facebook noise, or your breaking news noise from the app that you end up using. So making a podcast which is -16 LUFS is the thing to do. And there are lots of other numbers and things that you need to worry about, and there's a peak level that you also need to worry about, but frankly, don't worry about that. Just focus on getting your podcast to be -16 LUFS, which is how loud it is. And what that essentially allows you to do is that allows you to make a podcast. If you make audio fiction, it allows you to make a podcast of really nice dynamic range. So some of it can be very quiet, some of it can be very loud. That's all great. But a LUFS level is worked out by how loud the overall piece sounds, which is a really useful way of working out how loud something should end up sounding. And -16 is the thing to have a look at.
Right. And -16 is for stereo, and for mono, it's -19. But they perceptually they sound the same loudness. It's just because So yes, -16 for stereo, -19 for mono. But in reality, when you ask Adobe Audition, when you ask Hindenburg Journalist Pro, when you ask your digital audio workstation to produce a -16 LUFS file, it understands the difference between mono and stereo. So typically you don't need to worry about that. At the end of the day, if this podcast is in stereo, then bear in mind that all of the audio in it is actually mono. I'm in mono. You're in mono. Well, not on this show.
The music might be. Oh, okay. If you're panning, then that's a lovely thing.
Yeah, slightly.
But most of the time, it makes most of the time it's better just to leave it up to your piece of software and just focus on the -16 because your piece of software will understand what to actually do with it.
Well, that might be
you're right.
when the software is expert exporting it, I can see that. But like, for instance, I use, Isotope RX7. And when I set the loudness,
this is one of your plugins, isn't it?
Well, actually, it's way more than a plugin. This is $1,200 software.
There you go. You go.
It's insane. It's awesome. But anyway, you actually there's a module in it where you tell it how loud you want it to be. So that's why me as an engineer, I have to know if I'm working with a mono file, I tell it -19. If I have a stereo file,
I
have to tell it 6.
Absolutely. Yeah. So for most people, when you get to the export, setting it to -16 will be the right thing, and your software ought to know what it's doing with that. And you make a good point, because actually, when you're mastering stuff, when you're recording stuff in, then typically you'll record stuff in a little bit quieter. So broadcast radio uses -24 LUFS in the US, -23 LUFS in Europe. So that typically means that if you're working for a broadcaster and you export a piece of audio from your playout system and make it into a podcast, it's really quiet. Because the system hasn't worked out that you're not wanting to put this into your playout system, you're actually wanting to make this into a podcast. So it's a bit of a gotcha, particularly for radio people, is we use different LUFS levels when we're making radio for very good reasons. But when you are authoring for a podcast, ignore what the radio people will tell you, -23. Ignore what AES will tell you, which is somewhere between -20 and -16, and focus on what Apple and Google are asking for, which is -16. Now, just to make life more complicated, Spotify and Amazon Alexa ask for -14, which is really helpful of them. Thanks very much. You probably don't need to worry about that. If you can manage to produce 2 different versions, as I do, then great. But at the end of it, you don't need to worry too much. A loudness unit is equivalent to dB, and you're not going to hear the difference between -2 dB that much. But if you can author a different version for Spotify and for Amazon, then go for it. But the important thing for podcasting is to make sure that you standardize on -16. Now, what I've actually done is I've actually done some actual tech work on what podcasts are running at. So you can actually check your own podcast if you want to. You can go to podnews.net and just search for your podcast. And if I've tested it, it will automatically appear in there. But most podcasts, nicely, are in -16. There's a bit of a when you have a look at how podcasts work, there are some which are -19 or -18, that's fine. There are some which are -14 or -13, that's fine. But most of them are focusing on the -16 side. But there are an awful lot which are really quiet. I'm looking at one in front of me at the moment, which comes from NBC Sports, and it's -28. -28 is really, really, really quiet. Wow. And that's exactly what they've done. They've basically they've taken something out of their playout system, and they've stuck it into a podcasting service, and both the podcasting service and the producer hasn't understood that you should be making sure that it is loud enough,
right?
And so that's a rookie error, NBC Sports.
Yeah, a rookie error from a professional organization.
Yeah, because they're doing things right according to how they've been trained,
right?
And they're sticking something out at -25 essentially. It's close-ish to minus 25, but they've not understood that podcasting needs a different sound. Now, if you're using a really good podcast host, it will sort that out for you. So Omni Studio, for example, you can tick a box and it will automatically set it to -16 LUFS, which is really nice. Many podcast hosts don't do that. Many aren't as modern as Omni Studio are, and so you need to end up doing all of that hard work as well.
Right. So question, you mentioned before how Alexa and Spotify, they cache our episodes.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned that they want it to be minus 14. So my question is, for instance, my show, when I send them my show at minus 16, they cache it. But when they cache it, do they also boost it up to LUFS levels, to LUFS units?
So when you are producing, so for Amazon, they only cache when you're doing news briefings. And the reason why they cache for doing news briefings is, firstly, they want to make sure that the audio works. But also, secondly, they do resample the audio or re-author the audio. Yeah, so that it actually hits the correct LUFS level.
Okay.
So they do that for news briefings. My understanding is that they don't do that for podcasting. Podcasting on the Amazon system comes from TuneIn. And my understanding is that they don't actually touch any of the podcast audio.
Okay.
But yeah, so they will do that. I believe that Spotify as well will, they don't touch the audio, but I believe that they add a little bit of metadata to actually work out how loud to play that audio back, if you see what I mean. If you've got the audio, there's an audio smoothing setting that's probably on in your Spotify app, and it basically says play every song at the same volume level. And what that is essentially doing is it knows that this particular song or this particular podcast has been recorded 2 dB too quiet, and so therefore it will add 2 dB when it plays it back, which is quite neat.
Yeah.
So I believe that they will fix it. So, my normal advice is you can probably helpfully ignore what both Amazon and Spotify are actually saying.
Right.
And just focus on minus 16. But if you want to be super clever, then you can produce a different version for Amazon and for Spotify as well.
Right. Like you. That's what you're doing.
Yeah, like me. That's
so, all right, let's move on to bitrate, and we'll finish up with this. So, bitrate, of course, is the final bitrate of the MP3 or the M4A, I guess,
Yeah.
So again, the normal bitrate for stereo audio is, and again, I'm saying normal. I guess we should say the commonly accepted average is,
yes.
Anyway, for stereo, 128 kilobits per second, and for mono, 64 kilobits per second. And your post on this is awesome because it has a graphs of the stereo podcasts and mono podcasts. So yeah, you want to overview us on what you found with bit rates?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, so I've basically done the analysis for many different podcasts. I'm guessing it's now over 1,000 actually.
Wow.
And looked at what people are using. Yeah, you're right. So nearly 50% of people are using 128K stereo when you look at a stereo MP3 podcast. When you're looking at mono, then it's a bit of a split between 64 and 96. So the way that MP3 works on a slightly inaccurate way, but nevertheless is sort of vaguely right, is that when you make a mono file, you only need half of the bit rate, half of the audio information than you do for a stereo file. It's not quite true, but it kind of nearly is. So therefore, a 64K mono file should sound the same as a 128K stereo file. Right. That's the theory. And so if you make a 96K mono file, then that will sound roughly the same as 160K stereo. And that sounds pretty good. So basically most people are focusing on 128K for stereo and for 64 or 96 for mono. There's a couple of things that I would say on that. One thing is most podcasts out there that are in stereo probably don't need to be. And you could save yourself significant money if you made that mono, which is probably a good thing. It's beginning to be more important now, the size of the podcast file that you're giving people, because more and more people are now streaming their streaming your podcast through their mobile data, not downloading it first. So if you look at Google Podcasts, for example, that automatically streams, it doesn't download. The same is true for Spotify, although Spotify is slightly different. The same is true for smart speakers at home, and so on and so forth. So it's actually really important to make sure that your audio file is as small as it possibly can be, in order that works as flawlessly as it possibly can, as well. So that's an important side. So most podcasts out there are in stereo, and probably quite a lot of them don't really need to be, is what I guess I would say there.
Right. Yeah, and for people who are on the fence about that, like, for instance, this show, it really, I guess in essence, it does not need to be stereo, because I only play some intro music, which is stereo, and some outro music, which is stereo. But for me, my taste, I can't stand listening to music in mono, no matter what Neil Young says about it. I mean, it's wow.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I mean, it is a personal thing at the end of it, and the beauty of podcasting is that you are in control. So if you want to make something sound the way that you want to make it, then nobody else is actually telling you. Nobody is enforcing, at least, what that should be. But for the majority of people, look at mono rather than stereo. And by the way, personally look at AAC rather than MP3 is the other side of it as well. But certainly have a look at what you can do in terms of mono. A 96K mono file will always sound better than a 128K stereo file.
Right.
So that's always worthwhile, having a look at. I actually moved from MP3 over to AACHE purely because I was interested in it as a news story. Is there anything that will break? Apple actually wants you to produce AAC files. Is there anything that will break if I do that? What is it worthwhile? And it ended up sounding significantly better for the same bitrate. And I thought, well, this is probably something that I ought to be doing. And I've not had a single complaint about people who have been unable to hear the podcast. Now, when I was first involved in podcasting in January of 2005, that would have been a very different conversation. But right now, it's basically AAC. At least AAC is accepted everywhere, and AACHE, which is the more up-to-date version, as that is accepted in pretty well every player as well. So so that's what I end up doing. But then it begins to be a bit of a religious conversation around whether MP3 or AAC is better and all of that. And and maybe we don't want to go there.
Yeah, and we know we can't talk about religion or politics. By the way, I just want to remind everyone that in episode 120 of this show, me and Alan Tepper, we really went deep into MP3 versus the AAC, specifically the .M4A. And we talked about you, James, but we talked about you, and you weren't there. And like, I was looking at one or two of your articles, and I was like, I kind of had the idea that I would sort of talk about it and explain it. But then once we started recording and I was looking at the article, I'm like, you know what? We'll just wait till we get James on the show.
Are you a 48 kilohertz man or a 44.1 kilohertz?
I am a 48 kilohertz man, and I'm in the 48 kilohertz Alliance Hall of Fame already.
Well, excellent. Well done for you.
I don't know what that means, but
I think I'm trying to remember, but I think I am a 22.05 kilohertz man on my AAC file. I think.
Wait, really?
So I'm clearly the devil.
Oh, no. Are you serious though?
Yeah, I think that's what I'm doing.
No, but do you mean 44.1 or do you really mean 22.050?
I really mean 22.050
Okay.
at low bit rates.
Okay.
At low bit rates, 22.050 sounds better than 44.1. And my thing with obviously 48K sounds best. Obviously it does. But once you have, if you are working on if you're working on something which is confined in terms of bit rate, and you're looking at 128K or you're looking at 96K, 96K 44.1 will sound 96K 48 kilohertz will sound worse than 96K 44.1 kilohertz. There is no getting away from that, because you are trying to force more audio information into the same bit rate. So absolutely, 48K, I'm all for that if you're producing wonderful high bit rate MP3 files. If you're producing something which is 128K or less, then having a look at your sample rate is important as well. And certainly when you get down to 64K or even 48K, which I was using for a while, then the sample rate makes a tremendous difference in the overall quality of what it is that you're doing. And running a lower sample rate, is an important thing.
Yeah, see that to me, I
controversial.
Well, no. Here's the way I understand it. Maybe I don't think I'm wrong, but okay. So if let's take a mono MP3 at 64 kilobits per second. Okay? Yeah. Mono MP3, 64 kbps. Now, if I encode that with 48 kilohertz, and then I encode another one at 44.1, the difference is in the frequencies that are represented there, because a 48 kilohertz sample rate will capture frequencies up to 24 kilohertz. Mm-hmm. And a 44.1 sample rate will capture frequencies up to 22,050. So, a 64 kbps at 48 kilohertz, the file will be slightly bigger than if you used 44.1. So it's
the file should be the same size because it's 64K at the end of the day. It's 64K bits per second means that the file will be 64K bits per second. So the file will be the same size. What you're doing by using a higher sample rate is that you are trying to squash more bits of audio, more audio data into the same 64,000 bits per second that you have available to you in a 64K file. And so this is one of the interesting things learnt when broadcasting radio in a digital form, so broadcasting radio over the air, again, in a very bitrate confined space, is actually making sure that the sample rate is correct, but also making sure that you roll off some of the very high frequencies, you roll off some of the very low frequencies, so that you are giving the encoder less work to do, because at the end of the day, a 64K file probably won't be encoding the very high and the very low bit rates. And so actually what a lot of people, particularly in Europe where they use either MP2 or AACHE to broadcast radio, what a lot of European broadcasters have understood is that actually, it's very important to actually pre-treat the audio first, and that includes getting rid of some of the very high stuff and the very low stuff, so that you can actually focus on stuff which is easy for the encoder to actually encode, so that the majority of what you hear is encoded better. Is my understanding. I should point out I am not a professional sound engineer, and you are.
Right, but this is a tricky, this isn't.
I've opened the religion conversation.
Yeah, well, no, I'm just trying to understand it. I'm not, I may be in the 48 kilohertz Hall of Fame, but that
which is a great thing. And of what I've understood, on this, and having worked in this kind of area for quite some time, there is a big difference between what you give your encoder and what comes out the other end. And so, the worst thing, for example, if you are encoding a live radio station online, the worst thing you can do is plug in an FM tuner into an encoding unit and give it that, because you're already giving it worse sounding audio than you would if you were giving it a nice linear feed from your desk or from your from your station, ring main and so on. And and the equivalent also goes there in terms of what frequencies, the frequency range that you actually allow through to your encoder. So there are some very interesting things there, and I think absolutely the correct conversation when you're talking about great sounding audio is to look at 48 kilohertz in terms of sample rate. It does make a difference of the file size if you're saving in WAV, of course, but once you're saving in something which is bitrate constrained, like an MP3, a 64K MP3, which literally means 64,000 bits per second, then you basically need to make sure that it is as easy and as straightforward for the encoder as you possibly can, and that does mean getting rid of some of the bits of the audio that are hard for the encoder to end up doing, and that actually at the end of the day don't make too much of a difference to what the sound of audio is. And I would also say AM radio is still quite popular in your country, and indeed here in Australia. And the reason why AM radio is popular is that the audio content is great. The audio might not be, but the audio content itself is fantastic, and that's a really important thing for any podcaster to consider. It's actually not always what you encode in. It's the actual content of the podcast, which is also pretty handy and useful. And making sure that you process everything correctly, making sure that you understand how to use a microphone, is a surprisingly ununderstood thing. Yeah. So making sure that obviously works is an important thing as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's definite. And all the all the podcast coaches always like to repeat that too, that audio quality is important up to a point, but then it's really about the content, which and I don't know, like, has anyone ever really argued the opposite? Like you would think if like, I've never heard someone say, no, it doesn't matter what you're talking about, but you should record it really well. Like, whoever said that? No one said that. Right?
You would be surprised. I mean, again, my history of working in broadcast radio, you'll be surprised how many people on the internet say that they will not listen to a particular radio station because the audio quality isn't up to their particular satisfaction. And they would rather listen to a different radio station with, by the way, a completely different format and a different style of programming and everything else, because it happens to have 32 kilobits more audio quality. There's a weird, I'll tell you a tediously dull and boring story, but I was working for a radio station called Virgin Radio in the UK, and we had a radio station, a soul music station called The Groove, and this radio station went out on digital broadcast radio, DAB, at 128K. And this was not enough for a couple of people on the internet who kept on moaning at us that it shouldn't be 128K, it should be 160K. Oh. And it sounds very bad at 128K and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, one of the things that I ended up doing is I changed how that radio station was broadcast. And one morning, you could see on your radio, you could see that this wasn't 128K anymore, it was 160K. And your radio would actually say on it 160K and not 128K.
I already know where you're going with this.
Yeah. And the folks who were very vocal about our bitrate came in and they said, oh, this sounds so much better. Thank you so much. This sounds brilliant. Mm-hmm. This sounds excellent. And as you have probably already guessed, all I had done is I had added 32K's worth of image into the into the audio file so that the audio was still 128K. It's just that it said 160K on their radios. And I think there's quite a lot of this placebo stuff going on of people looking at a number and going, well, this must sound better than this because the number is bigger. And actually, at the end of the day, it's down to how good the encoder is. It's down to what somebody has done to treat the encoder first. I mean, and a great thing for you to try is to try saving a 48K MP3 file, save one at 44.1 kilohertz and save one at 22.05 kilohertz sampling rate, and just marvel at the tremendous difference in audio quality. And if you can hear it at that low bit rate, then there must be some effect at a higher bit rate as well, is my answer to that. Right.
Yeah, no, this is great stuff. I'm really enjoying this conversation, but I think we've been going for a while. It's got
into a very tedious phase, isn't it?
Oh, but this is what we love. This is this show. I somehow led you to this, James. I do want to just say one thing about the bit rate and the sample rate, and then I think we could wrap it up. But so bit rate is the size of so let's start with sample rate. So from a technical perspective, sample rate is, okay. So we're talking about, we're starting with an analog signal, and we're going to digitize an analog signal. And when we're digitizing the signal, we take a bunch of snapshots every second of the voltage of the electricity, right? Where's the electricity, all that. So we take a bunch of snapshots a second, and that's what sample rate is. If you take 44,100 snapshots every second, that's the sample rate. That's the rate of you taking a sample. And so every second, you're taking 44,100 snapshots, like with a camera. You could think of it that way. And I know, James, I know you probably know a lot of this, but I'm just speaking to everyone. So that's sample rate. And so it's literally within 1 second, 44,100 snapshots. Now, bit rate, what bit rate is each one of those snapshots, every one, it captures data using a certain amount of bits. And if you think of 16-bit audio, it's a 16-bit word, and we're talking about a computer, like a computer word, which is 16 characters of each one is a 1 or a 0. That's a bit. Like a bit, a byte is 8 bits, and a bit is just a 0 or a 1. So when it's 16-bit, like a WAV file, let's say, every snapshot, it's using 16 bits in order to come up with a value for the electricity at that moment. And 16 bits has a certain amount of resolution. And it's actually, there's about 65,000 different states that electricity can be in, that a 16-bit word can capture. Now, if you go to 24-bit, and this is one of the reasons why I advise everyone to record, if you can record in 24-bit, do it. Because a 24-bit word will, again, have 24 bits. So 24 is either a 0 or a 1, and all the combinations. A 24-bit word has, now I'm getting confused. Is it 16 million states? Yeah. 16 million states. Yeah. So the resolution that a 24-bit word can capture is way more than a 16-bit word. So now let's take the sample rate and bit rate and go to an MP3. 64 kilobits per second as a bit rate is what you said. It's 64,000. All right, let's start with sample rate. Sorry. Sample rate, if it's a 48 kilohertz MP3, it still should be, and I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, it still should be let's say 44.1. It still should be 44,100 snapshots every second, even though it's an MP3. But the data contained in each word, which is the bit rate, it might not be 16-bit. It might be 64 kilobits per second, which is smaller. So each sample is less resolution, but I would think there would be 44,100 samples every second. So I wonder if that's correct, or here's what I'm thinking: maybe uncompressed audio is different than compressed audio, right? The way they talk about
that's exactly it.
Okay.
So when you look at a WAV file, then a WAV file changes size depending on the sample rate.
Right.
When you look at a compressed audio file, then it doesn't. And what I will do for you as a special treat is I will send you a ton of files, which will be in the show notes of this podcast.
Okay.
Of a particular podcast which I recorded a while ago, encoded in lots of different formats and lots of different sample rates. And there happens to be, so one of them here is a 64K 48 kilohertz file in MP3, which ends up as nearly 1.6 meg. And then there's another one which is identical, but it's just at 22050 kilohertz, so it's half the sample rate, and that's exactly the same size. So it's exactly the same size file. It's just it's had to encode less complicated audio. So what you'll be able to do is to be able to have a listen to those two different files and work out which you think sounds better, right. And they may not sound remarkably different, but there's a big difference, I think, here in between. Yeah, there's a big difference in between. Obviously, bitrate is the thing that makes the real difference there. But I will give you that. There's I think 6 different files here.
Oh, sweet!
So I will give you those so you can so that you and everybody else can have a listen to them.
Perfect. I'll put it in the show notes. Everyone can go and click on it and check it out. So
yeah,
James Cridland, editor of Podnews, man, this has been awesome. Thanks for coming on the show.
It's a great pleasure, and if anybody out there still wants Podnews after all of this, then
what do you mean?
Then you're welcome to podnews.net is where you'll find it. It's completely free, and it comes out every morning US time, and contains about 2 minutes worth of information about podcasting and on demand.
And I will say, the Podnews, the daily email, it's very classy the way you do it. I like it. It just has a
Thank you, Chris.
It just has a better feel than a lot of the other emails you get about, the podcasting roundups and all this stuff. So, great job, James.
I appreciate that. That's great.
All right, and now the only last thing, and this applies to you, James, as well as everyone listening. You have to yell "sound great" at the very end here. Are you willing to yell?
Maybe.
All right, go. Sound great! You can grunt more too if you want.
You walk away from me well, and you can't play that part so well. But you're playing out on me now. You like to lose control well. It's quite a feeling, isn't it? They're floating, drifting down now. You tell me that you found something better. How should I respond to that? It's a still hold that meaning? Does it mean it's still the same? You're pushing me away. You worked your theories now.